I stared at the letter in my hands, my fingers trembling as I read the words again. It couldn't be true. It just couldn't. Mom! Peter's voice called from the kitchen. Have you seen my? He stopped short when he saw me standing in the living room, clutching the paper to my chest. What's wrong? I looked up at my son, searching his face for any sign of the boy I'd raised. The kind, thoughtful child who'd always put others first. But all I saw was a stranger, a man I barely recognized anymore. Peter, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. What is this? He frowned, taking a step closer. What's what? I thrust the letter at him, watching as his eyes widened in recognition. Oh, he said, his voice flat. That? I repeated, incredulous. Is that all you have to say? Your wife sent me a letter telling me you're taking over the house. My house. The house your father and I built together. Peter ran a hand through his hair, looking anywhere but at me. Mom, it's not like that. We just thought. You thought what? I interrupted, anger rising in my chest. That you could just kick me out of my own home? That I'd go quietly. He held up his hands, placating. No one's kicking you out. We just think it's time for a change. Rachel and we need more space. And you're getting older, Mom. Maybe it's time to downsize. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Downsize? Peter, I'm only 65. I'm not ready for a retirement home. That's not what I meant, he said, but his words rang hollow. The front door opened and Rachel breezed in, her designer purse swinging from her arm. Oh, hello, Emily, she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. I see you got my letter. I turned to face my daughter-in-law, the architect of this betrayal. Rachel, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. Would you care to explain why you think you have the right to take my home? Rachel's smile faltered for a moment before returning, brittle and forced. Now, Emily, there's no need to be dramatic. Peter and I simply feel it's time for a change. This house is much too big for just one person, and we could really use the extra space. And what about what I need? I asked, my voice rising. This is my home. George and I built it together. Every room holds memories of our life, of raising Peter. You can't just take that away from me. Peter stepped between us, his face a mask of discomfort. Mom, please. We're not trying to hurt you. We just think this is best for everyone. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and felt my heart break. When had he become this person? When had my sweet boy turned into a man who would choose his wife's desires over his mother's needs? Best for everyone? I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. Or best for you and Rachel? Rachel huffed, her patience clearly wearing thin. Emily, be reasonable. You can't expect to live here forever. It's time to move on. I felt something snap inside me. Years of biting my tongue, of watching my son change under Rachel's influence, of feeling like a stranger in my own family. It all came rushing to the surface. Get out, I said, my voice low and dangerous. Peter blinked, taken aback. What? I said, get out. I repeated, louder this time. Both of you. This is my house, and I want you to leave. Now. Rachel's mouth fell open in shock. You can't be serious. Oh, I'm very serious, I said, straightening my spine. And let me make one thing perfectly clear. This house is mine. It will always be mine. And if either of you tries to take it from me, I promise you'll regret it. As I watched them leave, Peter casting one last confused glance over his shoulder, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and determination settle over me. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. After Peter and Rachel left, I sank into George's old armchair, my mind reeling. How had it come to this? I closed my eyes, memories flooding back of a time when Peter was still my sweet, thoughtful boy. I remembered his high school graduation, the pride shining in his eyes as he hugged me tight. I did it, Mom, he'd said. And it's all thanks to you and Dad. George had clapped him on the back, beaming. You did the work, son. We just cheered you on. Those days seemed so far away now. I opened my eyes, glancing at the family photo on the mantel. Peter's smile was so genuine then, his arm around my shoulders. When had that changed? The phone rang, startling me from my reverie. I answered, hearing Peter's hesitant voice. "Mom, can we talk?" I sighed. "I'm not sure there's anything left to say, Peter." "Please, Mom. I want to explain." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him at the local diner. As I drove there, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was a mistake. Peter was already seated when I arrived, fidgeting with a napkin. He stood as I approached, uncertainty in his eyes. "Mom, I held up a hand, cutting him off. "Before you say anything, I want you to answer one question. And I want the truth, Peter. When did you start seeing me as a burden instead of your mother?" He flinched as if I'd slapped him. "Mom, that's not. Isn't it?" I interrupted, my voice low but firm. "Because that's exactly how it feels. Like you and Rachel can't wait to get rid of me so you can have the house to yourselves." Peter's shoulders slumped. "It's not like that. Rachel just thinks. She says we need to start planning for our future. For a family." I felt a pang in my chest. "And there's no room for me in that future?" "Of course there is," he insisted, but his eyes wouldn't meet mine. "We just thought maybe it would be easier if you had a smaller place. Somewhere without stairs, you know." I shook my head, disbelief washing over me. "Peter, I'm perfectly capable of managing my own home. The home your father and I built together. How can you not understand how important that is to me?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of George that it made my heart ache. "I do understand, Mom. It's just, Rachel says, Rachel thinks." I cut in, my patience wearing thin. "What about what you think, Peter? What about what I need?" Before he could answer, the bell above the diner door chimed. I looked up to see Rachel striding towards us, her face a mask of concern that didn't reach her eyes. "There you are," she said, sliding into the booth next to Peter. "I was worried when you didn't come home." I bit back a retort, watching as Peter seemed to shrink in on himself. This wasn't my son. This was a shadow of the man I'd raised, eclipsed by Rachel's domineering presence. "We were just discussing the house situation," I said, keeping my voice level. Rachel's smile was brittle. "Oh, good. I hope you're seeing reason, Emily. It really is for the best, you know." I felt something snap inside me. "The best for whom, Rachel?" "For you. Because it certainly isn't what's best for me, or for this family." Rachel's eyes narrowed. "Now, Emily, there's no need to be difficult. We're only thinking of your well-being." I stood, my hands flat on the table. "My well-being is just fine, thank you. And I'll tell you both one last time, that house is my home. I'm not leaving, and if you try to force me out, you'll regret it." As I walked away, I heard Rachel's voice, low and angry. "Peter, you need to do something about your mother. She can't keep standing in the way of our future." I paused at the door, turning back to see Peter's conflicted face. In that moment, I knew the battle for my home, and for my son, was far from over. And I was ready to fight. I sat in the sterile hospital waiting room, my heart pounding in my chest. George had been in with the doctor for what felt like hours. When he finally emerged, his face was ashen, and I knew. I just knew. "Emily," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk." We found a quiet corner, away from the bustle of nurses and patients. George took my hands in his grip tight. "It's cancer," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "Stage 4. They're giving me 6 months, maybe less." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "No," I breathed. "There must be some mistake. We can get a second opinion, we can." George shook his head, a sad smile on his face. "I've known something was wrong for a while, Em. This just confirms it." I felt tears welling up, but I blinked them back. "What do we do now?" He squeezed my hands. "We live, Emily. We make the most of the time we have left." As we drove home, my mind raced. How could I tell Peter? Would this news bring him back to us, make him remember what really mattered? Or would Rachel see it as an opportunity? We pulled into the driveway, and I was surprised to see Peter's car already there. As we entered the house, I heard voices from the kitchen, Peter and Rachel arguing in hushed tones. "We can't wait that long," Rachel was saying. "Who knows how long it'll take for the old man to kick the bucket?" I felt George stiffen beside me. "Rachel, for God's sake," Peter hissed. "That's my father you're talking about." I know," she said, not sounding the least bit apologetic. "But we need to think about our future, Peter. This house, your parents' savings, it could set us up for life." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Before George could stop me, I stormed into the kitchen. "How dare you?" I spat. Peter and Rachel jumped apart, guilt written all over their faces. "Mom, Dad," Peter stammered. "We didn't hear you come in." "Clearly," I said, my voice ice cold. "Otherwise you might have been more careful about discussing your plans for our death and your inheritance." Rachel had the grace to look embarrassed, but there was a calculating gleam in her eye that made my skin crawl. "Emily," she started, her voice sickly sweet, "you misunderstood. We were just—" "Save it," George interrupted, his normally gentle voice hard with anger. "I think we heard enough." Peter looked between us, his face pale. "Dad, what's going on? Why were you at the hospital?" I saw the moment George made his decision. "I have cancer, son. Terminal. 6 months, give or take." The color drained from Peter's face. "What? No, that can't be right." But Rachel's eyes had lit up with an emotion I couldn't quite place. Excitement? Anticipation? The sight made me feel ill. "Oh, George," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "That's terrible news. Is there anything we can do?" "You can get out of our house," I snapped, unable to contain my anger any longer. "Both of you." Peter looked stricken. "Mom, please. We didn't mean—" "Didn't mean what?" George asked, his voice tired. "Didn't mean for us to hear you planning our demise? Didn't mean to treat your mother like an inconvenience to be shuffled off to a nursing home." Rachel put a hand on Peter's arm. "We should go," she murmured. "Give them time to process." As they left, I turned to George, feeling more alone than ever. "What are we going to do?" He wrapped an arm around me, pulling me close. "We're going to fight, Emily. Not just my cancer, but for our family. For our home." I nodded, determination replacing my despair. "You're right. And I have an idea." George raised an eyebrow. "Oh, it's time we made some changes to your will," I said, a plan already forming in my mind. "If Peter and Rachel want this house so badly, let's see how far they're willing to go to get it." As we sat down to discuss the details, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a long and painful battle. But with George by my side, I was ready to face whatever came next. The weeks following George's diagnosis were a blur of doctor's appointments and hushed conversations. I tried to focus on making George comfortable, but the weight of our family's fracture hung heavy on my heart. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I heard Peter's car pull into the driveway. My heart leapt with hope. Maybe he'd come to his senses, to be there for his father in these difficult times. I was about to call out when I heard Rachel's voice, sharp and insistent. "We need to talk to them about the will, Peter. Time's running out." I froze, my hand on the kitchen door. I knew I shouldn't eavesdrop, but I couldn't help myself. "Not now, Rachel," Peter said, his voice tired. "Dad's sick. We can't just—" "That's exactly why we need to do this now," Rachel interrupted. "Before it's too late. Do you want to end up with nothing?" I heard Peter sigh. "It's not about the money. It's about family." Rachel's laugh was cold. "Family? Wake up, Peter. Your parents are holding us back. Once your father's gone, we can finally start our life together. No more worrying about your mother's feelings or this outdated house." My blood ran cold. I'd known Rachel was selfish, but this level of callousness shocked me to my core. "Rachel, please," Peter pleaded. "Can we not talk about this now?" "Fine," she snapped. "But don't come crying to me when your parents leave everything to charity and we're left with nothing." I heard their footsteps retreating, and I sagged against the counter, my mind reeling. How could Peter stand by and let Rachel talk about us, about his dying father, like that? I was still standing there, lost in thought, when George came into the kitchen. "Emily? Are you all right?" I turned to him, tears in my eyes. "Oh, George. I just overheard Peter and Rachel talking. It's worse than we thought." I recounted the conversation, watching George's face grow more troubled with each word. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. "We need to protect ourselves, Emily," he said finally. "And maybe teach them a lesson in the process." I nodded, a plan already forming in my mind. "The will. We can use it to ensure they can't just toss me aside once you're gone." George's eyes lit up with understanding. "A condition. We'll leave the house to Peter, but only if I'm allowed to live here," I finished. "For as long as I want." We spent the next hour outlining our plan, the excitement of outwitting Rachel momentarily overshadowing our grief. As we finished, I heard Peter and Rachel moving around upstairs. "Should we tell them?" I asked, suddenly uncertain. George shook his head. "No. Let them think they've won. It'll make the lesson all the more powerful when the time comes." Just then, Peter appeared in the doorway. "Mom, Dad, can we talk to you for a minute?" I exchanged a glance with George, steeling myself. "Of course, honey. What is it?" Peter shifted uncomfortably. "It's about the future. After, well, you know." Rachel appeared behind him, her face a mask of false concern. "We just want to make sure everything's taken care of. For all of us." I felt a surge of anger, but I pushed it down, forcing a smile. "Of course. Why don't we all sit down and discuss it?" As we moved to the living room, I caught George's eye. He gave me a subtle nod, and I knew we were on the same page. We would play along, let them think they were getting what they wanted. But in the end, we would have the last laugh. Sitting across from Peter and Rachel, watching them try to delicately broach the subject of George's will, I made a silent vow. I would protect our home, our legacy, and the memory of the family we once were, no matter the cost. The next morning, I woke to find George already up, poring over legal documents at the kitchen table. His face was drawn, the toll of his illness evident in the dark circles under his eyes. "George," I said softly, "you should be resting." He looked up, a determined glint in his eye. "No time for that, Em. We need to get this sorted before." He trailed off, but I understood. Before it was too late. I sat beside him, scanning the papers. "Is this the will?" He nodded. "I've been thinking about what we discussed. The conditional clause. It's risky, but I think it's our best shot at protecting you and teaching Peter a lesson." As we pored over the legal jargon, crafting the perfect wording for our plan, I couldn't help but feel a mix of sadness and resolve. This wasn't how I'd imagined spending our final months together, but circumstances had forced our hand. Just as we were finalizing the details, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Rachel standing there, a forced smile on her face. "Emily," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." Before I could respond, she brushed past me into the house. I gritted my teeth, following her to the kitchen where George quickly shuffled the papers out of sight. "George," Rachel said, her eyes darting around the room. "How are you feeling today?" "As well as can be expected," George replied, his voice neutral. Rachel nodded, feigning sympathy. "Peter and I have been so worried. We were thinking maybe it's time to consider some arrangements." I felt my blood begin to boil. "Arrangements?" She turned to me, her smile never wavering. "You know, for the future. We want to make sure everything's taken care of. For all of us." George and I exchanged a glance. This was it, the moment to put our plan into action. "Actually, Rachel," George said, his voice steady, "we've already made some arrangements. Would you like to discuss them?" Rachel's eyes lit up, barely concealing her eagerness. "Oh, of course. If you're feeling up to it." We sat at the kitchen table, the air thick with tension. George pulled out a copy of the will we'd just drafted, careful to keep the conditional clause hidden. "We've decided to leave the house to Peter," George began. Rachel's smile widened, but before she could speak, I cut in. But there are conditions. Her smile faltered. Conditions? George nodded. Yes. You see, this house isn't just a piece of property. It's our home. It's where we raised Peter, where we built our life together. We want to make sure it's respected and cared for. Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly. Of course. Peter and I would take excellent care of it. I leaned forward, meeting her gaze. And what about me, Rachel? Where do I fit into your plans for this house? She hesitated, caught off guard. Well, I'm sure we could come to some arrangement. A nice retirement community, perhaps. The casual way she suggested displacing me from my own home made my resolve strengthen. That won't be necessary, I said firmly, because one of the conditions of the will is that I'll be staying right here. Rachel's composure slipped for a moment, shock and anger flashing across her face before she schooled her features. I see. Well, I'm sure we can work something out that's mutually beneficial. As she left, promising to discuss it further with Peter, I turned to George. Do you think she suspects? He shook his head. No, I don't think so. But we need to be careful. They'll be watching us closely now. I nodded, a mix of emotions swirling inside me. We'd taken the first step in our plan, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. That night, as I lay awake listening to George's labored breathing beside me, I made a silent vow. No matter what happened, I would fight for our home, for George's memory, and for the son I knew was still somewhere inside Peter. The war had begun, and I was prepared to do whatever it took to win. The call came at 3:17 a.m. I fumbled for my phone, my heart already knowing what I'd hear. Mrs. Thompson? It's about your husband. The next few hours passed in a blur. The quiet hospital corridors, the sympathetic looks from nurses, the cold reality of signing papers I couldn't bring myself to read. George was gone. I sat in my living room, surrounded by the life we'd built together, feeling more alone than I ever had. The sun was just peeking over the horizon when I heard a car pull up. Peter burst through the door, his face pale and drawn. Mom! He choked out, pulling me into a tight embrace. For a moment I saw my little boy again, seeking comfort in his mother's arms. But then Rachel appeared behind him, and the illusion shattered. Her eyes were dry, her expression carefully composed. Emily, she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. We came as soon as we heard. Is there anything we can do? I pulled away from Peter, straightening my spine. No, thank you. I've made all the necessary arrangements. Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly. Are you sure? It's a lot to handle on your own. Perhaps it would be best if we stayed here for a while, to help out. I saw the glint in her eye, the barely concealed eagerness to get her foot in the door. That won't be necessary, I said firmly. This is my home, and I'm quite capable of managing on my own. The days that followed were a whirlwind of funeral preparations and well-wishers. Through it all, Rachel hovered, always ready with a suggestion about how things should be done or what George would have wanted. The morning of the funeral dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the heaviness in my heart. As I stood by George's casket, receiving condolences from friends and family, I overheard Rachel speaking to Peter in hushed tones. We need to talk to her about the house, she was saying. Strike while the iron's hot, before she has time to dig her heels in. I felt a surge of anger, but before I could confront them, the service began. As I listened to the pastor speak about George's life and legacy, I steeled myself for the battle I knew was coming. That evening, as the last of the mourners left, Rachel cornered me in the kitchen. Emily, she began, her voice sickly sweet. Peter and I have been talking, and we think it might be best if you considered other living arrangements. I stared at her, momentarily speechless. Excuse me. She pressed on, undeterred. It's just that this house is so big, and with George gone, well, we thought you might prefer something smaller, easier to manage. And where would you suggest I go? I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Rachel's smile widened. Oh, we've found the loveliest retirement community. Very active, lots of people your age. I'm sure you'd be much happier there." I felt a rage building inside me, threatening to explode. But before I could respond, Peter appeared in the doorway. "Mom," he said, his voice hesitant, "we really think this would be for the best. The house, well, it's rightfully ours now, isn't it?" In that moment, looking at my son, the boy I'd raised, the man George and I had poured our love and hopes into, I felt something inside me break. "Get out," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Rachel blinked, taken aback. "What?" I said. "Get out," I shouted, my composure finally shattering. "Both of you! How dare you come into my home, on the day of my husband's funeral, and try to force me out? This is my house, my life, and I will not be bullied by the likes of you." Peter looked stricken, but Rachel's face hardened. "You can't keep us out, Emily. The will says nothing of the sort," I interrupted, a grim smile spreading across my face. "And you're about to find out just how wrong you are." As they left, confusion and anger warring on their faces, I sank into George's old armchair. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since George's death, I felt a flicker of hope. Our plan was in motion, and soon, very soon, Peter and Rachel would learn the true cost of their greed. The day of the will reading arrived, heavy with anticipation. I sat in our lawyer's office, my heart pounding as Peter and Rachel took their seats across from me. Rachel's eyes gleamed with barely concealed triumph, while Peter looked uncomfortable, unable to meet my gaze. Mr. Jameson, our family lawyer, cleared his throat. "Shall we begin?" As he read through the standard legal jargon, I watched Rachel's smile grow wider. She reached for Peter's hand, squeezing it tightly. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. "Now, regarding the family home," Mr. Jameson continued, "Mr. Thompson has left it to his son Peter." Rachel's smile turned into a full-fledged grin. She turned to me, a look of false sympathy on her face. "Oh, Emily, I'm sure we can work something out. Perhaps a nice retirement community." "I'm not finished," Mr. Jameson interrupted, his voice sharp. Rachel's smile faltered as he continued reading. "The house is left to Peter on the condition that his mother, Emily Thompson, is allowed to reside there for as long as she wishes, rent-free and without interference." The room fell silent. I watched as the color drained from Rachel's face, her triumphant expression crumbling. "What?" she sputtered. That's not possible. There must be some mistake." Mr. Jameson shook his head. "No mistake, Mrs. Thompson. The will is quite clear." Peter looked stunned. But we thought." I leaned forward, my voice steady. "You thought what, Peter? That you could just toss me aside? That the home your father and I built meant nothing?" Rachel's shock quickly turned to anger. "This is ridiculous. We'll contest it. You can't do this to us." Mr. Jameson cleared his throat again. "I'm afraid there's more. Should the conditions of the will be violated, that is, should any attempt be made to force Mrs. Emily Thompson from her home, the property will be immediately transferred to a charitable trust. Neither Peter nor his wife will have any claim to it." The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel's face contorted with rage, while Peter looked like he might be sick. "You planned this," Rachel hissed, her eyes boring into me. "You and George, you set us up." I met her gaze, unflinching. "We protected our home and our legacy. Something you seem to have forgotten the value of." Peter finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," I replied, my heart breaking all over again at the stranger my son had become. "Your actions have said it all." As we left the office, Rachel stormed ahead, already on her phone, no doubt calling every lawyer she knew. Peter lingered behind, his shoulders slumped. "Mom," he started, but I held up a hand to stop him. "Not now, Peter. I think we both need some time to process this." I watched him walk away, feeling a mix of triumph and sorrow. We had won, George and I. Our home was safe. But at what cost? Back at the house, my house, I sank into George's favorite armchair, emotionally drained. I picked up a framed photo of our family from happier times, tracing Peter's smiling face with my finger. "Oh, George," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. "Did we do the right thing?" As if in answer, a warm breeze drifted through the open window, carrying the scent of the roses George had planted years ago. I closed my eyes, feeling a sense of peace wash over me. The battle was won, but the war wasn't over. Rachel wouldn't give up easily, and Peter, well, I hadn't given up hope for my son just yet. Whatever came next, I was ready. This was my home, my life, and I would fight for it with every breath I had. I stood up, squaring my shoulders. It was time to start living again, on my own terms. George would have wanted that. And who knew? Maybe, just maybe, this would be the wake-up call Peter needed to find his way back to the son we'd raised. With a deep breath, I opened the curtains wide, letting the sunlight flood in. A new chapter was beginning, and I was ready to face it head-on. Weeks passed, and the house fell into an uneasy quiet. I hadn't heard from Peter or Rachel since the will reading, and part of me was relieved. But as I sat in the garden one sunny afternoon, I heard the crunch of gravel in the driveway. My heart leapt to my throat as I saw Peter's car pull up. He stepped out, looking haggard and worn. Rachel emerged from the passenger side, her designer clothes wrinkled, her hair unkempt. I steeled myself as they approached. "Peter, Rachel," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "This is unexpected." Peter's eyes were red-rimmed, his voice hoarse. "Mom, we need to talk." I led them inside, an odd sense of déjà vu washing over me as we sat in the living room. The last time we'd been here like this, George was still alive, and our family was whole. Rachel spoke first, her usual bravado gone. "Emily, we've made a terrible mistake." I raised an eyebrow, waiting. Peter took a deep breath. "We're in trouble, Mom. Serious trouble. We took out loans against the house. We thought we'd inherit it, and we'd be able to pay them back. But now you can't." I finished for him. Rachel nodded, tears in her eyes. "They're going to take everything. Our car, our savings. We'll be on the street." I felt a mix of emotions. Anger, pity, a twisted sense of satisfaction. "And what do you expect me to do about it?" Peter leaned forward, desperation in his eyes. "We were hoping. Maybe you could help us? Loan us the money? Or let us move in here. Just until we get back on our feet." I stared at them, hardly believing what I was hearing. After everything they'd done, they had the audacity to ask for my help? "Let me get this straight," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You tried to force me out of my home. You disrespected your father's memory. And now you want me to bail you out." Rachel's tears flowed freely now. "Please, Emily. We have nowhere else to go." For a moment, I was tempted. The mother in me wanted to protect Peter, to shelter him from the consequences of his actions. But then I remembered George's words. Sometimes, love means letting them face the music. I took a deep breath. "No." Peter's face crumpled. "Mom, please." "No," I repeated more firmly this time. "You made your choices, Peter. You and Rachel. Now you have to live with them." Rachel's sorrow turned to anger. "How can you be so heartless? He's your son." I stood, my resolve strengthening. "Yes, he is. And it's time he learned to stand on his own 2 feet, without manipulating or taking advantage of others." Peter's shoulders slumped in defeat. What are we supposed to do?" I walked to the door, holding it open. "That's for you to figure out. But you won't do it here." As I watched them drive away, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It wasn't the ending I'd hoped for, but it was the one we'd all earned. In the months that followed, I heard through the grapevine that Peter and Rachel had moved into a small apartment across town. Peter had taken a job at the local factory, while Rachel was waitressing. It wasn't the life they'd envisioned, but it was honest work. One crisp fall morning, as I tended to George's roses, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Peter, looking older but somehow more like the son I remembered. "Mom," he said softly, I owe you an apology. A big one." I stood, brushing dirt from my hands. "Yes, you do. He nodded, his eyes filling with tears. I'm so sorry. For everything. I lost sight of what really mattered and I hurt you. Can you ever forgive me? I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw genuine remorse in his eyes. The wall I'd built around my heart began to crumble. Oh, Peter, I said, pulling him into a hug. I already have. As we stood there, surrounded by George's roses, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. Our family would never be the same, but maybe, just maybe, we could build something new. Something stronger. I looked up at the clear blue sky, feeling George's presence all around us. Thank you, I whispered, knowing he'd hear me. For everything. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I was ready to face it. After all, I was Emily Thompson. And I was home,